My name is Daniel Brooks, and I am 38 years old. I work as a facilities manager for a regional hospital network in Western Pennsylvania, a job that has taught me more about patients than any other experience in my life, because when you spend your days coordinating boiler repairs and emergency generator tests for a building full of sick people, you learn very quickly that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one doing the most important work. I did not expect that lesson to apply so directly to my own family, but it did. And it took a divorce attorney named Rosalind Pierce, standing at a backyard barbecue with a glass of lemonade in her hand, to teach me exactly how much my own brother had let a lie sit unchallenged for the better part of a year. Let me take you to the moment everything came apart, because that is where this story really starts, even though the truth of it began almost 11 months earlier. It was the last Saturday in June at my mother's house in Greensburg, at a small gathering she had asked us to throw to celebrate what she called simply closing a chapter. Her divorce from my father, after 31 years of marriage, had finally been finalized 2 weeks prior, and she wanted something quiet, just family and a few close friends, hot dogs on the grill, string lights hung between the porch posts, nothing extravagant. My brother Stephen had organized most of the party. He is 2 years older than me, works in sales for a pharmaceutical distributor, and has always had a gift for occasions, for making a room feel celebratory, even when the underlying reason for the celebration is something as complicated and painful as the end of our parents' marriage. I was standing near the cooler, getting myself another can of soda, when I heard Rosalind Pierce, my mother's divorce attorney, whom my mother had invited as a guest of honor of sorts, telling my Aunt Carol something that stopped me cold. "Your sister is one of the strongest women I've represented in 20 years of practice," Rosalind was saying, holding a paper plate of potato salad. "And you should be proud of Stephen, too, for stepping up the way he did. Not every family pays a retainer like that without blinking. $4,200 up front is not a small ask for most people, and he had it wired to my office within 3 days of the first consultation." I stood there holding my soda can, feeling something cold settle into my chest, because I was the one who had wired that retainer. Not Stephen. Me. I had transferred $4,200 to Pierce and Associates on a Tuesday morning in August of the previous year, from my own checking account, and I had never told a single member of my family that I had done it, because I did not want my mother to feel like she was accepting charity from her son during what was already the most humiliating and painful chapter of her life. I had asked Rosalind's office specifically to keep the payment confidential on my mother's account statements, listing it only as retainer paid in full, without a name attached on anything my mother might see. I had never imagined that somewhere along the way, my brother had apparently told Rosalind, told my Aunt Carol, and probably told half of our extended family that the money had come from him. I did not say anything in that moment. I want to be honest about that. I stood by the cooler for a long moment, replaying the sentence in my head, telling myself there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, the same way I imagine most people try to rationalize their way out of an uncomfortable truth before they are forced to face it directly. But there was no misunderstanding. Rosalind had said it plainly, with specific numbers, in a tone that suggested she had heard this story enough times, from enough people to state it as settled fact. I want you to sit with me in that moment for a second, because I think it matters. I was not angry, not yet. I was mostly just quiet and confused and turning over 11 months of family conversations in my head, trying to figure out how deep this lie actually went and how long it had been sitting there, underneath every conversation about my mother's divorce. Every time someone had praised Stephen for being such a supportive son. To understand why any of this mattered so much to me, you need to understand what my mother went through, and why I decided 11 months earlier to quietly pay for her legal representation without telling anyone, including her. My mother, Diane Brooks, married my father, Gerald, when she was 22 years old. She spent the next 3 decades running our household, raising Stephen and me, working part-time as a school cafeteria coordinator when we were young and later full-time once we were both in high school, all while my father built a modestly successful HVAC repair business that, over the years, became the primary source of our family's financial identity. My father was, by most external measures, a good provider. He was also, in ways that took me years to fully understand, a controlling and often cold presence in our home, the kind of man who managed every financial decision in the household without ever explaining his reasoning to my mother, who insisted on approving every purchase over $50 personally, and who, we later learned, had been keeping a separate business account for almost a decade that my mother had no knowledge of or access to. The marriage did not end because of one dramatic betrayal. It ended slowly, the way a lot of long marriages do, through 1,000 small erosions that eventually leave nothing standing. My mother told me, during one of our long phone calls in the months leading up to her decision to file, that she had spent 31 years feeling like an employee in her own household rather than a partner, someone whose labor was accepted without ever being truly valued. When she finally decided to file for divorce at 56 years old, she was terrified. Not of loneliness, she told me, but of money. She had no separate income of her own beyond a modest part-time job at a local elementary school, no retirement savings in her own name, and a husband who, she suspected correctly, would fight her on every single financial detail of the separation out of spite as much as genuine disagreement. "I don't even know if I can afford a lawyer good enough to go up against your father," she told me one night, her voice small and defeated in a way I had rarely heard from her. "He's already talked to someone. I know he has. He's going to bury me in paperwork, and I won't be able to keep up." I remember hanging up that phone call and sitting in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about every year my mother had spent making our house function, cooking dinner every single night even after working her own job, driving Stephen and me to baseball practice and orthodontist appointments and church youth group, doing the invisible labor that had made my father's business success possible in the first place, labor that had never once been reflected in any bank account with her name on it. I thought about how unfair it would be if, at the end of all of that, she ended up with an inferior attorney simply because she could not afford a better one, while my father, with his separate business account and decade of hidden savings, could afford the best representation money could buy. I called several attorneys in the area over the following week, and I settled on Rosalind Pierce, a divorce attorney with a strong reputation for representing spouses in long-term marriages involving hidden or unevenly distributed assets. Her consultation fee was manageable, but her retainer, $4,200 upfront before she would take the case, was a real sum of money, more than my mother had in her own checking account at the time. I called Rosalind's office directly, before my mother had even officially hired her, and I explained the situation. I told the office manager, a woman named Denise, that I wanted to pay the retainer myself, in full, but that I did not want my mother to know, at least not immediately. I told her I was worried my mother would refuse the help out of pride, or worse, feel so guilty about accepting it that it would add emotional weight to an already devastating time in her life. "I completely understand," Denise told me. "We can process the payment under your name internally for our own records, since we're legally required to document the source of retainer funds, but we won't disclose that to your mother unless she directly asks, and even then, we would check with you first before saying anything." I wired the money the following Tuesday, $4,200, in a single transaction from my personal savings account, which I had built up over several years specifically because I have always tried to keep a cushion for exactly this kind of unexpected necessity. I did not think of it as a sacrifice, not really. I thought of it as simply the correct thing to do, the same way you would not hesitate to help a friend who was drowning, even if helping cost you something. What I did not anticipate was Stephen. About 2 weeks after I made that payment, my mother called me, her voice full of a kind of grateful relief I had not heard from her in months. "Stephen paid the retainer for my attorney," she told me. "I don't even know how he had that kind of money lying around. But he told me not to worry about it, that he wanted to make sure I had good representation." I cried on the phone with him. "Daniel, I don't know what I'd do without you boys." I sat there holding my phone, feeling a familiar cold confusion settle over me. The same feeling I would experience much more sharply 11 months later at the backyard barbecue. I told myself in that moment that perhaps there had been some kind of miscommunication, that maybe Rosalind's office had simply told my mother the retainer was paid, without specifying by whom, and my mother, naturally assuming it must have been one of her sons who lived closer to her, or who she spoke to more frequently, had simply guessed Stephen, and Stephen, not wanting to correct her in a moment of such emotional vulnerability, had simply let the assumption stand. I want to be honest about something here because I think it is important to understanding the rest of this story. I did not confront Stephen immediately. I told myself I would ask him about it privately, one-on-one, without making it a bigger deal than it needed to be. I called him about a week later. "Hey, Mom mentioned you paid for her retainer with the divorce lawyer," I said, keeping my voice as neutral and casual as I could manage. "That's really generous of you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough that I noticed it. "Yeah," Stephen said finally. "I mean, somebody had to help her out. Dad's being a real piece of work about the whole thing." He did not correct me. He did not say, "Actually, Daniel, I think that might have been you. Does Mom have the wrong idea?" He simply accepted the compliment I had unknowingly extended to him and let it sit there between us unaddressed. I hung up the phone that day feeling unsettled in a way I could not fully articulate. Part of me wanted to believe it was an honest oversight, a moment of social awkwardness where correcting the record felt more uncomfortable than simply letting a small misunderstanding pass. But some part of me, a part one did not want to listen to at the time, understood that Stephen had made a choice in that phone call, and the choice was to let a lie stand rather than tell the truth, even when I had given him a direct, easy opening to do so. I want to introduce you to my Uncle Ray here, because he became an important voice of reason for me over the following months, in a way I did not fully appreciate until much later. Uncle Ray is my mother's older brother, a retired steelworker who has never had much patience for what he calls family theater, the elaborate performances people put on for each other instead of simply telling the truth. I mentioned the situation to him, carefully, over coffee one afternoon in October, framing it as a minor annoyance rather than the significant grievance it had actually become in my mind. "Let me ask you something," Ray said, setting down his coffee cup. "Why haven't you just told your mother the truth?" "Because it would embarrass Stephen," I said. "And honestly, I didn't want the money to become a whole thing. I just wanted to help her." "Daniel," Ray said, in that particular tone he uses when he thinks you are being foolish but loves you too much to say it harshly, you can want to help someone without hiding that you did it. Those are two different things. What you're doing now isn't generosity anymore. It's a secret, and secrets have a way of curdling into something uglier the longer they sit. I did not act on Ray's advice. Not that fall, not that winter. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, a moment that would not disrupt my mother's fragile process of rebuilding her life after 31 years of marriage. The divorce proceedings dragged on for months, far longer than any of us anticipated, because my father, exactly as my mother had feared, fought her on nearly every financial detail, forcing Rosalina Pierce's office to dig deep into years of hidden business accounts and undisclosed assets. Throughout that entire process, at every family dinner, every phone call, every mention of the case, Stephen continued to receive quiet credit for having made my mother's strong legal representation possible. He never once corrected it. Not when my Aunt Carol praised him at Thanksgiving. Not when my mother mentioned it, tearfully grateful, at Christmas. Not when Rosalind's own office, apparently under the impression that Stephen was the paying party since he had never corrected the record with them either during subsequent conversations, began referring to him informally as the family's point of contact for billing matters. I want to pause here and be honest about something uncomfortable, which is that I bear some responsibility for how long this went on, and I do not want to present myself in this story as purely a victim of my brother's dishonesty. I chose silence too, for almost a year, out of my own particular fears, fear of embarrassing Stephen publicly, fear of disrupting my mother's healing process, fear of being perceived as someone who needed credit for doing something good. Grace Holloway, a close friend of mine from college who has since become something of an unofficial family counselor for me over the years, told me something once that I think applies directly to this situation, even though she said it about an entirely different matter. She told me that silence is never neutral, that if you do not fill a space with the truth, someone else will fill it with whatever benefits them, and you will eventually have to deal with the consequences of that filled space, whether you intended to create it or not. I did not act on this wisdom until Rosalind Pierce, entirely by accident, forced my hand at my mother's backyard barbecue. Let me take you back to that Saturday in June, because I left you standing by the cooler with my soda can, and I want you to understand exactly how the rest of that afternoon unfolded. After I overheard Rosalind's comment to my Aunt Carol, I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to simply let it go, the way I had let it go for the past 11 months. But something had shifted in me by that point. Some accumulated weight of nearly a year of watching my brother accept credit for something he had not done in front of a family that increasingly viewed him as the responsible, generous son, while I remained, in most people's minds, simply the quieter, less remarkable one. I walked over to where Rosalind was standing and gently asked if I could speak with her privately for a moment. She excused herself from my Aunt Carol and followed me a few steps away, near the fence line at the edge of my mother's backyard. I couldn't help overhearing what you said to my aunt, I told her. About the retainer payment. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Who actually paid that retainer? Do you have that on record? Rosalind looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression. Of course I have it on record. We're required to document the source of retainer payments for our files. It was paid by you, Daniel. I remember processing it myself when you called our office directly. Why do you ask? I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, a strange mixture of vindication and dread, because I now had confirmation of what I had already suspected. But I also understood that this confirmation, spoken by Rosalind in a backyard full of my family, was about to become impossible to contain. Because Stephen has apparently been telling everyone for almost a year now that he paid it, I said quietly, including my mother. She thinks Stephen paid for her legal representation this entire time. Rosalind's expression shifted into something between surprise and professional caution. I had no idea, she said. I've mentioned it to a few people today, assuming everyone already knew the accurate story, since it's simply what's in our files. I'm so sorry if I've caused a problem. You haven't caused the problem, I told her. You've just accidentally exposed one that's been sitting here for 11 months. I want to tell you honestly that I did not plan what happened next. I had no intention, walking into that barbecue, of confronting Stephen publicly. But sometimes the truth has its own momentum once it starts moving, and this was one of those times. My mother, who had been standing near the grill talking with Stephen's wife, must have caught some fragment of my conversation with Rosalind, because she walked over, her expression concerned. Is everything all right over here? She asked. Rosalind, to her credit, did not try to deflect or minimize what she had already said. Diane, she said gently, I think there might be some confusion about who paid your retainer last year. I was just telling Daniel that our office records show the payment came from him, not Stephen. My mother's face went through a series of expressions in quick succession: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like grief. That's not right, she said slowly. Stephen told me he paid it. He specifically told me, Mom, don't worry about the money. I've got it covered. I have the payment records in our office system, Rosalind said, her voice gentle but firm, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome facts in emotionally charged situations. The wire transfer came from Daniel Brooks in August of last year. I remember the conversation with him directly because he specifically asked us to keep his name off any correspondence that might go to you, so you wouldn't feel obligated or embarrassed. By this point, several other family members had noticed the shift in tone near the fence line and had begun drifting over, the way people do when they sense something significant is unfolding. Stephen, who had been manning the grill about 20 feet away, noticed the small crowd gathering and walked over as well, spatula still in hand, a curious, slightly wary expression on his face. What's going on? He asked. My mother turned to him, and I watched her face, watched the specific moment when 11 months of belief collided with a different, harder truth. Stephen, she said, her voice shaking slightly, did you pay for my retainer with Rosalind, or did Daniel? I want to describe Stephen's face in that moment as precisely as I can, because it told me everything I needed to know about how deliberate his choice had been over the past year. He did not look confused. He did not look like someone encountering an unexpected accusation for the first time. He looked like someone who had been dreading this exact conversation for 11 months and had simply been hoping, against increasingly poor odds, that it would never actually arrive. Mom, he started and then stopped, glancing at me, then at Rosalind, then back at our mother. Just answer the question, I said, And I noticed my own voice had a steadiness to it that surprised me, a calm that came, I think, from having finally reached the end of a year of holding something in. I never said I paid the whole thing, Stephen said. And there it was again, the exact same deflection Vanessa had used in an entirely different family's kitchen, though I did not know that parallel yet at the time. I said I helped out. You told me word for word, my mother said, her voice rising now. Don't worry about the money, Mom. I've got it covered. You said that to me on the phone. I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when you said it. I was going to tell you eventually, Stephen said, and I watched something in him deflate slightly, the confident posture of a man used to being praised collapsing into something smaller and more defensive. I just didn't want to make a big deal out of it in the moment. You've had 11 months, I said quietly. 11 months of Mom thanking you, of Aunt Carol praising you at Thanksgiving, of Rosalind's own office thinking you were the one paying the bills. That's not forgetting to mention something. That's actively letting a lie grow for almost a year. My mother sat down heavily in one of the folding lawn chairs near the fence, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. I remember the sound of the grill hissing somewhere behind us, someone's radio playing softly from an open car window down the street, the ordinary sounds of a summer afternoon continuing on, indifferent to the quiet devastation happening in the middle of it. Why didn't you just tell me it was you, Daniel? My mother asked finally, looking up at me, her eyes wet. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something, I said. I didn't want you carrying guilt about the money on top of everything else you were already carrying that year. I just wanted you to have good representation, and I wanted you to focus on getting through the divorce, not on worrying about how you'd pay me back. But you let Stephen get the credit, she said, not accusingly, just working through it out loud. For almost a year. I didn't let him, I said. I didn't know, at first, that he was claiming it directly. I thought maybe there had been a simple mix-up. It wasn't until today, standing right here, that I found out he'd been telling people specifically, with details, that the money came from him. Stephen, to his credit, did not try to argue further at that point. He set the spatula down on a nearby table, and he said, quietly, I'm sorry, Mom. I should have corrected it a long time ago. It just felt good, I guess, having you and everyone else think I'd stepped up like that. And once I let it go on for a few weeks, it got harder to correct without looking even worse. I appreciated that admission, even in that moment, even surrounded by the wreckage of an entire afternoon that had been planned as a celebration and had turned into something much heavier. It is a very human thing, I think, to let a small lie grow because correcting it feels more humiliating than simply letting it continue. I understood that impulse even as I stood there feeling the sting of 11 months of quiet erasure. The barbecue did not end in shouting or slam doors, which I am grateful for, because my mother, even in the middle of processing this new information, was clearly determined not to let this become the defining memory of the day meant to celebrate her freedom. She asked, gently but firmly, that we table the conversation for later, and the party resumed in a subdued, careful way. Conversations happening in smaller clusters, an unmistakable undercurrent of tension running beneath the surface of everyone's forced normalcy. Rosalind approached me privately before she left that afternoon. I'm sorry if I caused trouble, she said again. I genuinely thought everyone already knew. You didn't cause the trouble, I told her, echoing what I had said earlier. You just told the truth. That's not something you need to apologize for. Over the following weeks, my mother and I had several long conversations about what had happened, some of them difficult, some of them surprisingly healing. She told me during one of these conversations that what hurt her most was not really the misplaced credit itself, but the discovery that Stephen had been comfortable letting her believe something false for almost a year, through an entire divorce process during which she had specifically thanked him repeatedly, sincerely, for something he had not actually done. I kept telling people how proud I was of him, she said to me one evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. I told my sister, I told my friends from church, I told the ladies in my book club. Every time, I meant it so genuinely. And the whole time, it wasn't even true. It doesn't erase the divorce being hard, or you getting through it, I told her. But I understand why finding out changes how you look back at that whole year. I want to tell you what happened with Stephen over the months that followed, because I think it matters as much as the confrontation itself. Stephen and I did not speak for almost 6 weeks after that barbecue, the longest period of silence between us in our adult lives. When we finally did talk, it was at his initiative, a phone call in early August, almost exactly a year after I had originally wired that retainer payment. I've been thinking a lot about why I did it, he said. I don't have a good excuse, Daniel. I think I like being seen as the responsible one, the one who steps up. You've always been quieter about that kind of thing, and I think somewhere along the way I got used to being the one who gets noticed for it, even when it wasn't deserved. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. But saying it to me isn't really the point. You need to say it to Mom and to Aunt Carol and to anyone else you told that story to over the past year. Not because I need the credit. I never wanted credit in the first place. That's actually the whole reason I asked Rosalind's office to keep it quiet. But Mom deserves to know the actual truth about who was in her corner during the worst year of her life, and everyone who praised you for something you didn't do deserves to know the accurate version too. Stephen did eventually do this. It took him several more weeks, but he called our Aunt Carol directly, and he spoke with our mother again, more thoroughly this time, acknowledging clearly that the retainer payment had come from me, not from him, and apologizing for having let the misunderstanding persist for so long. It was not a perfect or dramatic reconciliation. Stephen is still, in many ways, the same person he was before all of this happened, someone who values being seen as generous almost as much as he values actually being generous. But he did, to his credit, correct the record once I made clear that correcting it was the minimum requirement for us moving forward as brothers. My relationship with Stephen today is quieter than it used to be, more careful, the way relationships often become after a significant breach of trust, even one that gets partially repaired. We still see each other at family gatherings. We are still cordial, even warm at times, but something fundamental shifted in how much I take at face value when he describes his own generosity or good deeds. I have learned to verify, gently but consistently, rather than simply accepting his account of things the way I once did without question. My mother, for her part, has fully rebuilt her life in the years since her divorce finalized. She works more hours now at the elementary school, has opened her own bank account for the first time in 3 decades, and has told me on more than one occasion that despite the pain of the divorce and the additional pain of discovering Stephen's small, sustained deception, she feels more like herself than she has in years. I do not think those two things are unrelated. I think the same year that forced her to confront a marriage built on unequal power and hidden truths also, eventually, forced our whole family to confront a smaller but similarly shaped dishonesty within itself. And coming out the other side of both of those reckonings has left her, and honestly all of us, more clear-eyed about what real support actually looks like. I think about Uncle Ray's words often now, about how secrets curdle the longer they sit, about how choosing silence to avoid embarrassing someone else can end up costing you something much larger down the road. I do not regret paying for my mother's retainer. I would do it again in an instant, exactly the same way without hesitation. But I have learned the hard way that quiet generosity without any accompanying truth creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled, sometimes by people who are more interested in how something looks than in what actually happened. If you have ever quietly done something generous for someone you love, only to watch someone else claim the credit for it, I want you to know that speaking the truth, even months later, even when it disrupts a celebration, is never the wrong choice. The discomfort of a difficult conversation is always smaller than the long-term cost of letting a lie stand. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we bring you real stories just like this one every single week. Stories about family, about truth, about what happens when quiet sacrifice finally comes to light. Leave a comment below and tell me, would you have confronted your sibling sooner than I did? Or would you have let it sit the way I initially did? Give this video a like if you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, no matter how long it takes, and I will see you in the next story.